You are listening to the Cookbook Love Podcast with Maggie Green, episode number 266.
Welcome to the Cookbook Love Podcast, a podcast that celebrates cookbook readers, buyers, collectors, writers, and clubs. And now your host, cookbook author, culinary dietitian, and cookbook writing coach, Maggie Green.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Cookbook Love Podcast. How's everybody doing today? Excited to be here with you again for yet another episode. And as always, I want to thank everyone for tuning in to listen. Today, you're going to enjoy an interview that I had with Raeanne Sarazen. Raeann is a registered dietitian and chef who combines over 20 years of experience producing recipe content as a test kitchen professional, food writer, and editor. She is the author of the new book, The Complete Recipe Writing Guide, which is an essential resource for anyone who wants to develop, write, and produce recipe content. Today on the podcast, Raeann and I talk in depth about the new book, her tips for writing recipes, as well as a lot of tips for new recipe content creators, in particular if you're struggling to figure out how to get started with a recipe writing project. But before we get started, if you're a food or nutrition expert who wants to write a cookbook, but you're unsure where to start, how to spend your time, or what publishers are looking for, have you checked out my fun free training? Inside this training, I cover common mistakes cookbook writers make, 4 steps to make your work appealing to publishers, and a great publishing path to choose if you do not want to spend your own time or money editing, laying out, designing, or printing your book. You can access this on-demand training by registering at www.cookbookwritersacademy.com/free. And in this training, you will learn how to use your time wisely and work on the things that publishers love, such as creating your cookbook platform, developing a marketable concept, and writing a cookbook proposal that they will never be able to forget. Again, you can access that training at www.cookbookwritersacademy.com/free. So now let's dive in and talk to Raeanne Sarazen all about her new book, The Complete Recipe Writing Guide, and all the tips that she has for recipe content creators. Hi, Raeann. Welcome to the Cookbook Love Podcast.
Hi, Maggie. I'm excited to be here today.
I'm so excited for you to be here, too. We're taking a little bit of a detour from talking specifically about cookbooks, but this is all totally going to fit. I can't wait for everyone to hear about you and your book. So why don't you tell everybody a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Well, I'm Raeanne Sarazen, a registered dietitian and classically trained chef. I specialize in nutrition-focused recipe development, food writing, and editing. And as you mentioned, I'm also the author of the just-released book, The Complete Recipe Writing Guide, which is a comprehensive and professional resource book dedicated entirely to the subject of recipes.
Yeah, and I have to say this book has been much needed. There have been 2 really great recipe books written that I use all the time, and it's nice. And knowing that those weren't going to be updated, it's nice to see that this is out, and I can't wait to introduce everybody to this whole book and what you've done here. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about what kind of book this is? Because it isn't exactly like a cookbook. It's a different kind of book, but why don't you share a little bit more about the book itself?
Wow. Well, the book is really, as I said, very comprehensive. It really covers the whole entire recipe workflow. So it starts with the first 6 chapters on recipe development that are heavily focused on nutrition. It then moves on to recipe writing, testing, nutrition analysis, and the ever so important topic of food photography, food styling, and video. So it really is a type of book that anybody can use, and it's not meant to be read like a novel. It's meant to be read as a resource book where you can open a chapter of it, find and take from it what you need, and it is really something that could really help up your game.
Yeah. And the fact that it has the food photography, the food styling, and the food video is something that I think truly makes this unique, in addition to all the updates that you did, and just in the being the nutrition information, how to modify for certain things. It's really been amazing to look through the book, and I'm glad you mentioned that people should use it kind of as a guidebook. That's what it's called. But why don't we talk a little bit about just some snapshots of the different sections, and we'll talk a little bit about those, and let's talk about recipe development first. Maybe just a simple, like, what does that mean, and like what might be included in that part of the book?
Well, the recipe development section is the largest section. It started out as 3 chapters, which then grew into 6. The very first one goes over just recipe development in general, which really is just about trying to understand the process and explaining flavor combinations and salt and everything that kind of goes into that aspect, which really starts with a big focus on knowing who your audience is. That's the first step. And it's also then takes you through what a lot of professionals do for brainstorming, where I do a lot of brainstorming. I keep my brainstorm notes actually on my note app on my phone. So if I'm out to dinner or if I'm traveling and I think, wow, that's a really cool flavor combination, I'll reference that later when I have a recipe development project. And then it really moves on to a lot of the research. And I'm a big believer in looking at what other people have done. And sometimes, depending on what I've done and what I have found that others have done too, is that you can create a whole recipe spreadsheet, and you can take something like a pad thai recipe and you can look at many different versions, put them side by side, and really compare the different ingredients. And depending on how much time you want to spend, you can test their versions and see how you want to tweak your own. So I think it's the brainstorming, it's the research, it's the writing it down on paper, it's going into the kitchen, it's testing it, it's tasting it, it's retesting it, and it's a process that takes a lot longer than people would anticipate.
Yeah. And I think the word development, really, if you dive into that word and you think of something developing, it really does embody what this part of recipe writing means.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting, what is also very different about this book is that I think a lot of chefs know how to do recipe development, and each chapter in this book really has its own distinct set of skills. So even within the recipe development chapters, even though the first one is something that more is geared toward just a regular chef and how they would approach recipe development, the rest of the other 5 chapters really focus on how do you translate nutrition guidance into recipes. So the chapter on plant-based recipe development, the chapter that's also on food allergies and food intolerances, and then the chapter on celiac disease and FODMAP. And interspersed throughout all these chapters really touch on some of the big diet-related health conditions that we have, and helps the cook, the chef, the cooking school teacher, the health professional really understand how to make these translations from the kitchen into the page.
Yeah. Yeah. And then they have to then, once this is developed, capture all of this on paper and start to actually write the title, the head notes, ingredients, instructions. A lot of things go into the actual recipe writing part, which is a whole nother section of your book. What do you think is missing today from most nutrition-focused food and recipe writing?
Oh, well, I think, first it's improved. I'd like to say that, but I really think flavor often is where a lot of people miss the boat, because they know that something needs to be removed, like salt, but they don't look at the whole idea of, like, well, what other sort of umami sort of ingredients can you use? Can you use MSG even to enhance the flavor of something when you're removing the salt? And I think my biggest thing about nutrition-focused recipe development is that a lot of people don't think about the end user, and I don't think there's a sense of empathy that is involved, because a lot of people who have dietary restrictions, there's a lot of grief and loss that comes with that, and I think you really have to understand food and how to give them a recipe that allows them to continue to have that identity of the way they like to eat, and importantly, focuses on flavor.
Yeah. So I think that that's really important because they're the ones, if they're going to be using these, if these recipes end up in a cookbook, for example, and they buy the cookbook, they've been newly diagnosed. Having empathy for them is hugely important. So I'm really glad that you pointed that out, because this book with these recipes could really be life-changing for them if they find recipes that work, that taste good, and help them to feel better.
I think so too. And I think there are some great professionals out there. I don't know if I answered the question about, who is this book for? There are just so many people that can use this book. It could be a food writer who wants to feel more comfortable developing recipes for their stories. And sometimes, since health is such a focus on, food writing today, this book is a perfect resource for them to feel more comfortable. It could be for healthcare professionals, primarily dietitians, but even culinary medicine programs where they want to learn how to translate this dietary guidance and teach people, their patients, or for dietitians that are writing articles. And I'd also really say that this book is really useful for even probably a lot of your listeners, because it's really for anyone who wants to learn how to translate their kitchen creations onto the page. And as you mentioned earlier, Maggie, it's truly different skills. Somebody who is a really good recipe developer, that process is quite different than somebody who's really good at recipe testing. And recipe writing is a whole nother set of skills.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And you have a section in the book on recipe testing. Would you be willing to define, according to what you say in the book, about what's the difference between developing a recipe and testing a recipe?
Okay, well, I don't think I can reach my book with my headphones, but I think the biggest difference is I think of recipe development as a creative process, as an art, as something that really is about experimenting and tasting and just using something that is really, the focus is on enjoyment. I think of recipe testing as something totally different. Recipe testing is nothing more than being very exact, precise, and following the recipe exactly as it's written. Yeah. And that doesn't, that would be true if I were to say this is in a professional test kitchen at a food company, or in your own kitchen and you just wrote a cookbook and you want to send it off to your friends to test your recipes.
I would ask them to cook the recipe exactly as I send it to them and let me know how it turns out based on a set of questions. Because I want to know that they're going to be able to recreate it and get the good results that I got in my kitchen, because what use is a recipe if someone's not able to do that?
That is for sure. And I would say the most important part about recipe writing is actually the testing, because that's the way that you'll know if the written recipe actually works, is by testing it. So I always find that to be an often overlooked step in the recipe journey, but the testing is just, I think, the best way. And even I know when I've sent my recipes out to my kids and I will, have them try to do this recipe and they'll come back with the craziest questions. I'm like, oh my gosh, that seems so obvious to
Yes,
me.
Exactly. And I think that's an important point to make for those of us that cook or bake a lot, and we're very familiar with moving around and doing things in our kitchen without even hardly thinking about it. Slowing down and putting all the steps in and telling people what to do is all part of this, because I think we do take it for granted.
For sure. And I think that if you use home testers for your cookbooks, for anybody who out there wants to try that, I think it's really good to type up a list of instructions for them, which actually there is a sample page that you can share with your testers in my book. But it's really about really basics, like read the recipe all the way through. Don't make your own substitutions unless you check with me if that would be a good one. To not guess even on the size of the pan you're using. If you're unsure, get out your ruler. So it's really exacting, but I think people wouldn't think of it unless they're given really clear instructions on how to do it for you.
Yeah, that's for sure. So what was it then that led you to write this book, Raeann? I mean, this isn't the kind of book that we often think, oh, gee, I'm going to write a guide to recipe writing, but something had to inspire you to take this journey. What was that all about?
Well, all right, let's start with the truth, which is the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics called me. They saw a need because a lot of their dietitians were creating recipe content, either for food companies or a lot of them were starting blogs. Nutrition people like myself, dietitians, don't necessarily have a culinary background. So for them, it was filling a void that they felt was really needed. For me, I really felt like, as you had mentioned, Maggie, that there are two books that were once really used by
Yeah.
people who were food writers like myself too, Recipes in a Type and the Recipe Writer's Handbook. I think they both go back to 2001 or 2 in 1997. And so we're talking many years later. A book like this, in my opinion, I thought was really necessary. And importantly, I felt like when I was starting out in this field, those books were good and they were around, but I just really felt like there was a lot that was still missing. And for me, I really wanted to pay it forward by writing this book and giving people both the knowledge that I have, but importantly, really curating the knowledge of others. And in this book, I interviewed some of the top people in each chapter. Each chapter was reviewed several times or many times by 3 to like 7 reviewers. So it felt for me, it was like it was giving back and helping to share my knowledge and share the knowledge of other experts as well.
Yeah. And I think that the other two books, great. Like I said, everybody, I mean, I've seen them in editing departments at publishers. I know I've had them on my shelf. You have them on your shelf. But the things that your book adds to this is the whole discussion on developing for health modifications. And I think that that's important to point out. The health modification part of this, if you're making recipes, why don't you again talk about those disease states or things that you really focused on for health in the development process?
Well, I'm trying to think back on the second chapter after the one on the basic recipe development. It focuses on just the recipes for health and wellness. So it kind of compares all of the different guidance that's out there, whether it's the Mediterranean pyramid, the dietary guidelines for Americans, the DASH diet. I try to curate all of the different dietary recommendations that people hear about and are often confused about.
Yeah.
And I really then took people through some of the ways, showing them how even with recipe development, you can use the food label as a reference. You can use the federal government dietary health claims as a reference. But also, most importantly, is creating your own set of guidelines to what you consider to be dairy-free, gluten-free, healthy, low sodium, low fat, whatever your parameter is that you're writing about.
Yeah.
I give examples as to guidelines, numbers, and specifics, but really it's like everything, be consistent with your content and create your own standards.
Yeah. You also talked about plant-based diets, food allergies, food sensitivities, and of course the restrictions or modifications for fat, sodium, sugar, then celiac disease and gluten-free, which is a very popular topic, something that people are very interested in. A lot of people asking for recipe content related to that. And then the FODMAP intolerance. And so I think that this book, adding those health things on top of the recipe writing and development, really speaks to what's going on in our world today, where people are seeking recipe and nutrition content and recipe driven nutrition focused content to help them do better cooking in the kitchen for themselves or the people in their family who need these kinds of recipes.
Well, I would agree wholeheartedly. 2 of my 3 adult children have celiac disease. And so this chapter, especially for me, I think is fabulous, and everything that anyone who has a child with celiac, anyone who develops any gluten-free recipes should definitely reference as a resource.
Yeah, so that's wonderful. And I think also the other section that is unique is your whole conversation about nutrition analysis. Now, as we know, not every recipe has nutrition analysis. That's the numbers at the bottom of the recipe that might describe how many calories are in a serving, grams of carbohydrate, protein, fat, any nutrient you can think of, you can have software to analyze it. But if someone is interested in doing that for their recipes, this book gives you some guidance on how to go about it in a correct fashion. And I think it's terrific and amazing that you did that, because it's a little more specialized than just the recipe development part.
Yeah, and it's really funny. First of all, just to note, I'm an incredibly curious person, and I love to learn by any project I take on. And I really felt like there was so much that I could add within each chapter. But what I enjoyed so much about writing this book was talking to other experts and asking questions, either just to hear how they do something, what was their approach, because this is how I did it, and then to sort of then share back to all the readers of this for this book, what are sort of best practices. So they're not just my best practices, but there are many others in the field. And that specific chapter, Maggie, had, I think, 8 reviewers, people who did nutrition analysis for food companies, people who actually developed the programs, the automatic plugins I had conversations with. And I think that chapter alone really could be its own book. And there is a great book out there. Kathy Powers has written a book, and Cheryl Dolvin. But I think what this chapter makes it different even from their very useful book is that it's summarized very quickly and telling you how to. What is the best practice for recipes that are deep fried? How do you account for recipes that have sodium added to the water when you blanch vegetables or you make pasta? It's all the questions that I remember having myself and wondering, who do I call to ask this question to?
Yeah. And a lot of times, like if you have a marinade on a chicken breast and you don't consume the marinade, it's just there to season the chicken breast. How do you account for that? How much actually goes on the grill with the chicken and how much doesn't? So a lot of excellent things covered in that section that I think are going to be very helpful for people writing modified recipes that have the nutrition information on them.
And also, I think, too, it's like asking the questions of what type of software you want to buy and to really analyze the type of recipe plugin that you're using for the analysis. And really to know that nutrition analysis is an estimate. And that is, I guess if there's one thing that I always find funny is that if somebody puts down like it has 342 calories, and I don't know why I always notice that, because I just think it's such an estimate. You might as well just round it. It's not that exact.
Yeah, I guess so. And I did nutrition work for someone, like the analysis part for recipes for a cookbook. And I remember thinking, I guess I just reported probably exactly what came out of the software program. I looked at it to make sure it all made sense and that the portion sizes were correct and what I'd put in was correct. But I guess I never really even thought about rounding things up or down for calories.
Yeah, and I guess I just think of it as it's sort of as an educational tool on the recipes, meaning that they're not exact. It's not 71 milligrams of sodium. I don't know. It just always feels like there's room for error, and I think.
No, I see what you mean. It's probably more. It's probably more along the lines of accurate to say this is going to have around 70 milligrams of sodium per serving. I mean, it could be plus or minus, 10% or more. Really, by the time but it is an estimate, and it's better than not having the information. In particular, if you're dealing with a disease state and you want to, or you need to count carbs, or you need to know how much sodium is in something. It is a very important thing to have in there. So I'm really glad that you had a section that covered all of that.
Yeah, and I would also just say that I think some of the nutrition analysis out there is interesting, because one thing that I've learned is that if you look at a lot of the better software programs or even the recipe plugins, I really went deep and I'm like, okay, well, gosh, the New York Times has all these automated recipes, automated calculators that are just doing this. Why should anybody pay me anymore to do something with the software program? But I do think, besides for food labels, for an example, you can't do that from a calculator. There's a lot more accuracy when you have control to go in and you're choosing the specific type of Dijon mustard, for example, that has a specific amount of sodium in it, or you are specifically choosing from, 30 different versions of a type of chicken breast. It seems like there's not a lot of thought that goes into it, but the automated calculators will just sort of pull up the best and closest thing. And they're pretty accurate for the time. But I think that if you're going to do real accuracy, you have to really hire somebody to do the analysis.
I think so too. And of course, that all really starts with the development, because if you're truly controlling for sodium, there's so many things you can do from the cooking end to make recommendations about how to even the kind of chicken, like you mentioned, that you would choose, the kind of mustard you would choose. That certain seasonings, while they may never even say salt on the label, are loaded with sodium.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
So I think it's a very fascinating topic. And I think the other thing the human eye can do that the calculators can't do as you're reviewing that is you can see things that are out of whack. Like if I was doing a nutrition analysis and I ran across the sodium content, let's say it said, 9,000 milligrams in a serving, I'd be like, okay, something's wrong.
Right.
That can't be right. Let me go back and check my work and make sure that everything is correct. So I think that it's a vote for having human oversight for sure. The software does most of the work, but then humans actually make sure that it's actually correct. And it starts from the very beginning of the recipe development work all the way through until the book is published. Because then we got to check for, making sure that there's no transcription errors, things get, typeset correctly or turned correctly. So yeah, it's all along the way.
Definitely with cookbooks and everything, there's always so many places that there's, potential error. I know that each chapter in this book, when I kept on getting it back version after version, I'm like, oh, I don't know if I can read this chapter.
I know.
And then I think to myself, did I write that? Did somebody
Where
edit
those
that?
words come from?
Are those my words?
It's really true.
It's sort of, that's a whole nother process of the book.
And it's funny when people, and you call the book the complete recipe writing guide. And when people think about recipes, they think about writing them, but it's really just so much more than that. And we've barely just scratched the surface, but I hope everybody can see in most situations how much goes into creating a recipe. And maybe also too, why people feel so proud of their recipes, why they feel so invested in their recipes, and why when we get something that works and is very popular, it's an amazing feeling to have that recipe out in the world doing its thing, helping people in their kitchen. I always say it helps them heal, learn, or have fun, and that's what recipes are all about. And you're certainly,
I agree.
Yeah. So it's great.
What's really funny about recipes, and it's like we could just geek out on it. I think, recipes are interesting because to the reader, they're so simple, right? As people would say, they get on a blog, they're like, oh, I don't want to read all this. Just scroll down to the recipe. Just give me the recipe. But I think recipes are a lot more complex, and there's a lot of invisible work that goes on behind the scenes in creating really good recipe content. And I think that my book really sort of draws back that curtain and lets everybody peek inside and say, gosh, that was a lot of work, starting from the development, just the ideation, the testing, the writing, the rewriting, the copy editing, and then all the beautiful photos, all the work that goes into staging and setting up a photo shoot and the video editing and the script writing. And there's just, it seems very simple on the outside to all of us, but there is a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes.
Yeah, I think that's really true. Now, let's suppose there's someone listening that is like a great cook. Like they can go in the kitchen and whip up a lasagna today without a recipe. It's all in their head. But they have been asked over and over again to start sharing their recipes. Can you give us your recipe? Can you document your recipe? What would you tell someone who is that kind of a cook that is already producing blue ribbon food that needs to start documenting what they do and creating recipes for their family, for their friends, or maybe they want to perhaps write a cookbook?
In some ways, it's kind of a hard question because I think some really good cooks or chefs are just sort of creative and freewheeling, that they themselves, if they try to write that recipe down that they're creating, can't even a week or two later follow their own recipe. So I think part of it is maybe, getting somebody who can watch you as you're cooking, which could be your grandchild, your child, your spouse, your friend, and they are documenting what you're doing and asking you to measure, or they measure the ingredients before you just sort of throw in that little bit of salt or that little bit of vinegar. Otherwise, I think it's sort of asking somebody who has one skill to be really good at doing another skill. And I think, we all have to know what we're good at. And perhaps if they really want to create a family cookbook, it's getting somebody else involved than just the the grandma or the grandpa who wants to document their stuff for posterity.
Yeah. And you made me think it's a great way to work in the kitchen with someone you care about. If you want them to be involved or learn, they can watch you, they can document the quantities. And then I think a step beyond that is the next time you make the lasagna, take the list of ingredients that the person wrote down and try it with that quantity and see how it turns out. Don't even worry about the instructions yet, but just try the quantities, see how it works out. And if you need to adjust something, you can adjust it on that piece of paper. And then dive into trying to describe the steps to actually putting the lasagna together. Because that's like a whole nother thing when you have to get into the instructions. Yeah. So what do you think about the instructions?
Well, the instructions, I think, serve a really clear purpose. It's to instruct the reader on what you want them to do, period. And I think that's hard because you have to be very clear. You have to have an explanation for things that you would have to think ahead of time, like fold. Well, what is fold? What is deglaze? What is dredge? And, we could talk, Maggie, about like the history of recipes where back when there was no explanation about anything, what type of bowl to use. It was just an assumption in almost 4 sentences that somebody could put together coq au vin with barely any instruction. But I think people today, which is sort of another thing, I think people should write recipes for people who really want to follow recipes, because the people who will improvise on recipes, which are a lot of people, including myself, I think they're going to improvise no matter what. So you have to write for the people who really want to be able to learn and follow what you're saying. And then they will go off eventually and do it their own way.
Yeah, that's right. And they'll make that recipe their own. And your recipe will suddenly become modified over and over and over again and become a family recipe. Because there's, I think there's this question like, is there anything really like new in food and food combinations? But when you think about something like lasagna, like how many recipes for lasagna do you think are out there in the world?
Well, it's funny. When I was starting out also in the field and I was hired to do some recipe development, and I'm like, well, I don't know how to make this candied orange rind peel. What is that? Get the pith. What was the pith? This is before I went to culinary school.
Yeah.
And I think really what it is there are certain techniques and things that are going to be the same, because you can't use the pith of a rind when you're making candy rinds. But the way somebody describes what they're doing, it's like storytelling. We can all have the same story in life, but it's our version of it. And so I think that the list of ingredients is a version, but so is the way we tell how we use those ingredients.
Yeah. I've always had this vision of like getting someone in the room cooking and having like 5, 8 people around watching, and everybody that's watching has to write their own recipe for whatever it is that person is cooking. And you know what? We would get 8 versions, and they probably would all in some way, shape, or form develop into something that works. But you're exactly right. The way that we express what someone is doing, even though we're all watching the same thing, is what makes recipes unique. It's the way I talk and describe something versus the way Raeann talks and describes something that makes our voice come through in the writing of the recipe.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, because I think recipes are about storytelling. And if you're a good storyteller, you could be a very good writer. And
it's not in the ingredient. Well, do ingredient lists, do you think they tell a story? I guess they do. They could tell a story about a place.
For sure about a place. I don't know if I don't think it tells as much of a story as the way the person would say how they're using the ingredients. But I think an ingredient list, which obviously I'm assuming everybody knows, the cardinal rule of writing the ingredients in the order of which they're used. But I think ingredient lists can be really confusing, and you could do it stylistically your own way as well. Not one is right or wrong. I tend to try to write recipes where people are going to the grocery store and buying the entire ingredient. So it's like 1 stalk of celery versus a half, or a half of a carrot, or a half of a can of chicken broth or whatever, because I keep thinking the way I like to approach recipes is thinking about the reader.
Yeah.
And I know that no one's going to want a half a cup of, their canned broth left over and then ask themselves, well, what am I supposed to do with it?
Right. And it does make it easier from a shopping perspective. One of my sisters, I have a big family. One of my sisters is an accountant. And I get lots of opinions about the way I write recipes from the people in my family, which recipe writers probably do. And she would say, just tell me the cup quantity. I don't want to know how many stalks. I just want to know but this is her exacting nature. I want to know if it's a half a cup of celery, because aren't stalks like different sizes? And I say they are, but in some recipes, it probably doesn't matter that much. If you put two ribs or whatever, see, that's even another thing.
Is it a rib or a stalk?
Right. What it's called. Like if you're making a tuna salad or a soup, it might not matter. She's like, really? And I said, really? And so it's funny how even different people using recipes like different things. But I do agree with you. I think it's easier to shop from a recipe that tells you the quantity to buy at the grocery store.
Right.
And then go from there.
Yeah. Right.
Totally.
And I also think it's like bringing yourself back to the younger person who's just learning to cook. Even like a half a cup of minced onion, it seems like maybe which I have in the book, the different quantities of what you can convert. A small onion is X amount, half a cup chopped, or a large onion is 1 cup chopped. But the reality is most people look at a recipe and they don't know. And so they don't know what to go to the store to buy.
Right.
And I think that, I always think of the reader and how useful it is and try to bring myself back to what it felt like when I was starting out.
Yeah. Do you have any sense of what's the most common recipe writing mistakes you see?
Oh gosh, I don't know. Like I think there's so many. I think one is that people often confuse when we talk about celery. They could say something like, let's see, 1 cup celery chopped. And so I always think when they look at where the comma goes, it's kind of confusing because you can't measure a whole piece of celery in a measuring cup and then chop it.
Right.
So things like that, though, I think people are feeling they're trying to be very helpful. They're often making it a bit more confusing for people. Yeah. In terms of other mistakes that I commonly see, I mean, this one's maybe a bugaboo more than anything else, but I don't like to see nutrition information or serving sizes really squeezed. Meaning, like if someone has a pound of pasta, I don't want to see 8 servings. To me, I think like there's just an unrealistic aspect to that because you're making, again, the person who's making it realize, gosh, well, maybe I have a pound of pasta and we can barely, feeding 4 of us is barely enough for a pound. So sometimes the nutrition information is a little bit like
skewed.
Yes.
Yeah.
So as a dietitian,
because if you look at if you look at a pound of pasta and you're serving an entree size portion, you're not going to feed 8 people.
No, even if 2 ounces is the serving.
Exactly. But then you think, well, I guess I'm going to divide this quantity by this larger number to get smaller nutritional values. It really does do a disservice to people. It's the same thing if you look at a bottle of kombucha. This has, I'm just making this up, 150 calories, but there's 2 servings in this one bottle. And we all know that everybody
is drinking the whole bottle.
Yeah. Right. But the nutrition information, maybe it's to meet a certain parameter. I don't know. But then we divide it down into a lesser number of portions. So I do agree about that also. And I don't think all cookbooks have to have nutrition analysis either. I'm an RD. I've written 4 cookbooks, and you know how many have nutrition analysis in them? 0.
Yeah. And I would like to make that clear. I agree with you as a dietitian as well, meaning that I think, though, if your recipe is going to have a health claim or a diet-related
100%.
claim, I think a recipe analysis is necessary. But if you're just producing a cookbook that is just for, no other reason than enjoyment or on like on Spanish cuisine or something, I don't think it really needs it at all.
No, I agree. And I think it makes us too focused on those numbers when really in the end, they matter, but they don't matter. The enjoyment of the food and the sharing of it with people and experiencing a new recipe is more important. But again, if you're writing it for a specific audience that has a specific health condition, I think it makes perfect sense. But mine weren't designed that way. I did not include it in any of them. And in fact, I think the only books that I've been involved in that did nutrition analysis were specific. One was about blood pressure, and one was a diet, it involved calorie things. So of course we needed calorie information in it. So I agree.
Yeah. And I think also with sodium, just to sort of get back to something health and wellness, I think it's really hard. I believe our food products have too much salt in them. So it's very, very difficult to keep the sodium down on recipes because I think we need to make a policy about changing food products to reduce the sodium totally, because I don't think it's so much from the salt shaker that's the issue.
Yeah.
And that makes it really challenging for recipe developers who need to keep the numbers down.
I think so too.
And then I did think of another one that was really funny that I oftentimes see when I get a recipe and it says 20 minutes. And I sometimes think, oh gosh, buried in step 3, you're asking the reader to marinate overnight. And I'm like, wait a minute, you can't write that. That's a
Can't do that
20-minute
20
recipe.
minutes. Right.
That's that one I see as well. Or like, the preheating of the oven in step 1, and they really need to chill the
They
dough
use it the next
overnight.
day when they cook the chicken and not when they're marinated. No, I agree. And I
there's a
think that you
bunch.
really have to think through the steps that you think the cook should take and really pay attention to what you do. And if you're marinating it overnight, sure, the cooking step might only take 20 minutes if it's on the grill, but you need to give people a heads up that this requires an overnight marinade. You can say things like that in the head note I love head notes. What's your, tell me a little bit about what your thought. Now, head notes are, y'all are cookbook people, you know what I'm talking about, but it's that beautiful paragraph or sometimes more that's written before you actually have the instructions. What do you think about head notes, Raeann?
Well, I like head notes too. I like them for me when I'm learning something. And I know that, for others, they may say they would love to sort of feel as though like the story of the grandma in the kitchen and the memory of that Christmas meal, etc. But I always find that it's super interesting to have the head notes say, oh, you could substitute this, or this is something that is an ingredient you can really only get in Hanoi, this version, but here in the States, you can get it like this. I don't know. I like to learn in the recipe head note.
Yeah. So are you like a lot of people that listen to this show that like to read cookbooks?
Okay. Well,
tell us the truth.
The truth. Well, okay. I have so many cookbooks as we are live so we can see each other's offices. I have way too many cookbooks. Yeah. I don't read them from front to back. I will read recipes and I will read the head notes, and I read them a lot for inspiration and to get educated. I mean, yeah. So I don't know. Do you, Maggie, read a cookbook from front to back?
Well, it's funny. I don't read it from front to back. And the way I've started actually reading cookbooks is I go from the end. I look through the index, see if I see anything that looks like, oh wow, I've never seen a recipe for that before. And I flip. I love to read if the acknowledgments are in the back, and then I head through the book and flip to things that look new or different. And if it's something that's a common recipe that I've seen in a lot of books, I like to read how they do it. There was a recipe in a book I just got for orzo mac and cheese. And I thought, I want to read that because mac and cheese everywhere. A lot of people know what it is, at least. What is it about this recipe? So I love to read people's twist on common things as well. And I think it's important to remember something that you said and just reiterate that there's always new cooks entering the market as people who are learning to cook. Those of us that know how to cook, other people take our place. And basic recipes are always going to be needed to help people get their footing in the kitchen. Twist on things will be needed. New inspirational things are needed. So it's so important to know the audience for what you're working on.
Definitely. Audience is always number one.
And I think for people to review cookbooks and say this cookbook is no good, it's got recipes for things we've already seen. I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Who is the audience? And what is it about this particular set of basic recipes that is really valuable for the people that will buy this book?
I agree 100% because you're right. There are only so many variations of chocolate chip cookies or mac and cheese or lasagna. I got a whole
book I just got in the mail for a chocolate chip cookie cookbook. And she's coming on the show, Katie Jacobs. I don't know when she's coming on, but it's all chocolate chip cookies.
Okay. Well, which is interesting because I have to say, if I were ever to do a second business, I have the best chocolate chip cookie recipe by far. And because of my kids being celiac, or 2 of them, I have truly tested probably 15 different gluten-free chocolate chip cookies. I think mine right now are truly the best as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And you can totally, so that's what I mean. I think that you can take something like that and you can go 100 ways or more with it's just one thing.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
and I'm like, I am like you. I love to look at things that I know how to do and learn how somebody else does it.
And how they think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
it's really fun for me as an experienced cook in my 50s to read what cooks who are writing books that are in their 30s are saying and writing, and how they're writing about things.
Yeah. No, for
and
sure.
where they learn. I think it's fascinating. And so I believe and I'm so glad you agree with me. If anybody's listening and you think, well, I don't really have anything new or different, I just want you to know that the way you do it is what's new and different. And the way you talk about it and teach it and tell the stories about it is what makes the book different.
I would agree 100%. And I even thought when I was writing this book, I thought, well, so many people know everything about recipe development. I know chefs that are just incredible. I know people who are incredibly talented in food styling. And I know some of the top editors that are now retired, but I'm like, okay, well, why should I write this book? And I thought, well, you know something, I have a voice. I have done this in my career for over 20 years. I've worked in all different areas with recipes, starting all the way back, if I can share, as a clinical dietitian.
Yeah.
Creating recipes that were for head and neck cancer patients and AIDS patients. I have worked in food media and publishing as a test kitchen director and assistant food editor. I have written extensively for different publications, and I've even have restaurant experience. So all three of those areas worked with recipes, and all three of those areas, I have my perspective and the perspective of all the people who gave me so much of their knowledge that I have has become part of me.
Yeah.
So, and I think we all have so much to give from our knowledge.
And it might not be, and so for you were one of the perfect people to write this book, and you happened to get the offer. You said yes. You followed through on the project. You
over,
did
just
it.
For the record, almost 5 years. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Books are a long game for the most part.
Yeah.
Now you can do a short, really nice little book. You can self-publish it on KDP. You can get it out there. You can write recipes. You can do family cookbooks. I can totally see how this was a long game book, though, especially with the addition of food photography, which we won't talk about this today, but the food styling tips and then the video. That's a whole nother section.
It's a whole nother section.
Right.
But yeah, and I never thought this was going to be my first book. I have hundreds and hundreds, I don't even know, of my own recipes that I had planned on doing a project, a family cookbook, like so many, and not so much to get it published, but to give to my children for posterity and to have it stay alive. Yeah. I started it years ago in iBooks. I think I don't even know when Kindle started it. And it was a lot of work, and I got busy with other projects that I do for, food companies and nonprofits. And I'm like, oh, I'll never get to it. But I think I will, but I need a break from writing books right now.
It's like having a baby. It's like you never ask if you're going to have another baby within like the first couple of weeks, because it's like, of course not.
Well, I was going to say, a colleague emailed me when they saw my book out on Amazon, and she said to me, "You just gave birth to your fourth child."
Exactly, and you know how that feels, and it's true. But I think you probably do have another book in you, Raeann. I'm sure that you can take everything that you've learned and everything you know and create a beautiful book that will make a difference in people's lives. So I look forward to having you on the podcast again to talk about that book
thank you.
when the time comes.
Thank you.
So as we're wrapping up, something I like to ask all my guests is if you have a favorite cookbook and what that might be.
Okay. I knew you were going to ask this question. So just for everybody out there, I should probably have a really short and quick response, but I don't. I think my favorite cookbook, when people ask, well, what would you give a young person, is The Joy of Cooking, which is your fabulous book, and Mark Bittman's How to Cook Everything. I learned a lot from reading Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, Samin Nosrat. But truly and genuinely to my heart, I think my cookbooks that are my favorite are my mom's cookbooks. Not so much because I've cooked from them, but because they hold the memory of her, and the spine is broken on I think it's called the Jewish Cookery book. The other one that I absolutely love, because my mom really wasn't that great of a cook, but she tried, was Thoughts for Buffet. I think it was in 1958. It's this fabulous book on entertaining with menus. And I do recall, in a very lovely way, watching her in the kitchen and seeing those books now, which can just make me tear up. So.
I know. It's amazing to think that you have books that you're interacting with that belong to her and that she turned to and used as a trusted guide for when she needed it. And not being a particularly, like they said, not a good cook or experience. I mean, sure, she had experience, but she used them.
My grandmother had a restaurant. And so I think my
Wow.
grandmother was never one to really teach my mother.
Yeah.
And so she held on to these books, and they're very worn, torn, and ingredients splattered. And they have so much of her alive in it when I hold them.
What kind of a restaurant did your grandmother have?
It was in Ottumwa, Iowa, called the Red Lion Inn. And it was where truck stop people would come. And she was sort of a woman before her time.
Yeah. Did she ever document any of her recipes?
I documented her recipes.
Oh, you did? Do you have those?
I do. In the manner of which I suggest others who cannot write a recipe.
Yeah, help document someone you care about. If they're a good cook, help them document theirs.
Oh, I definitely did. And it's a treasured set of recipes that I had to share with my siblings, from making her stop and writing and doing everything that I would say to somebody else to do as well.
Well, that's a terrific story. So really your recipe documentation and writing started along, when you were working on that. Little did you know where it was going to lead you today.
Oh, I had no idea. But I kind of like the title, when you asked me at the beginning, well, who are you? What do you do? I have a lot of things that I do, which I guess I didn't mention, but I think of myself as a recipe documentarian. I love to document. I love the history and the stories, and I would love to get your favorite recipes and try them out for this weekend. It's like sharing a part of each other.
It really is. It really is. And I think that that's what makes recipes fun and unique. And every recipe out there for lasagna is different because the person that wrote it is different. So if there's ever fear that AI is going to take over the world, which I guess I don't know. In recipe writing, you'll be able to tell if it does.
Yeah, and I don't know.
Recipes will all start to look the same, and that's not the way it should be.
Yeah, and also I think with AI, like all new technologies, which has really changed the publishing industry, right? Like that has changed tremendously. But I think it's all of us trying to figure out how to work with AI and how it can act as a tool and an aid for us versus being afraid of it.
Yeah, I think you're right about that too. Well, it's been a pleasure, Raeann, to have you on the show today. I would love for you to let everyone know how they can connect with you online and where they might be able to find your book, the Complete Recipe Writing Guide.
So let's see. My name is my email, or I should say my website, RaeanneSarazen.com. And the spelling, which I will spell, is RaeAnne. My last name is Sarazen, SARAZEN.com. You can find out more about the book, more about me by checking out my website. You can also purchase the book on Amazon, the Eat Right store, which is the Academy's publishing department, and also Barnes & Noble and other online booksellers.
Okay. And I'll link to the book at Amazon at the Eat Right store, which is the bookstore for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. And then also to your website so people can link to that over from the show notes. All right. Well, it's been great to have you on the show. I can't thank you enough. We have, I'm sure, just scratched the surface of recipes, but the Recipe Writing Guide will be a great tool in everyone's kitchen if you're serious about recipe writing or if you want to read a book about it. It's a beautiful book, and congratulations, and thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Maggie, very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode of the Cookbook Love podcast. Again, all the links can be found in the show notes at www.cookbooklove.co. And if you are interested in writing a cookbook of your own, please check out the free cookbook writing masterclass called How to Get Paid to Write a Cookbook. It is designed specifically for food or nutrition experts, and you can check that out at www.cookbookwritersacademy.com/free. So that's it for today's episode of the Cookbook Love podcast. This is your host, Maggie Green. And until next time, have a great day and keep loving your cookbooks.
Thanks for listening to the Cookbook Love Podcast. You can find out more information at www.cookbooklove.co.